Now, by the way, that picture should offend you if you're a follower of Jesus. It was not meant to offend people, though, ironically. And so, why is it that this picture, characterization of the victorious coming again Christ does not offend people? Now, I would suggest it doesn't offend many people because this Jesus is so popular, especially among mega churches. Because this Jesus is an invention of later doctrines and theological schemes, the premillennial Jesus. But it clashes with the historical Jesus' teachings and actions, for example. Are we to believe that the same Jesus that told Pilate, "My disciples are not going to fight," the same Jesus who rebuked Peter for cutting off the ear of one of the people that came to arrest him in the garden, and the same Jesus who asked God to forgive the very brutes who were crucifying him, are we to believe that all of a sudden the Jesus coming back to earth has someone changed his mind and his personality? Jesus got to heaven and changed his mind for some reason, apparently. Maybe he got to heaven and his dad straightened him out. "Son, I'm sending you back to earth. This time, instead of dying for the souls of people and telling them to love their enemies, this time show them who's really in charge. In fact, let's start off by having you kill several thousand people. And listen, Jesus, nobody down there likes a loser." Excuse my sarcasm. I just can't believe that. I can't believe the same Jesus, the historical Jesus, who talked about forgiving enemies, who said his disciples would not fight, is going to come back and start a war. That is an invention of a particular theological persuasion, by the way, which is only about 100 years old as well. So this picture should offend all followers of Jesus. It is something that our culture associates with, and that's, let's be honest, a love for violence and power, and an addiction to power in the world. But Jesus of Nazareth recognized the harm power does in human relationships and society. Power corrupts and often results in conflict. The conflict comes from either trying to maintain power, if you've got power, or to power over someone else. And again, the result is often violence. Look at history. So the historical Jesus had a problem with that. Now, some of you know that I wrote a book on how Jesus and Paul responded to systemic power in their ministry. Now, I may return and talk about this power issue as we go through this series. But let me point out one example in the historical Jesus about this issue with power and his problem with power. And that would be Jesus' own relationship with his father, Joseph. And I think this will illustrate Jesus' attitude towards one of the most abusive systems of power in his day and continuing today. And that was patriarchy. Patriarchy is a word made up from two Greek words that means father rules. And it's certainly in the ancient Mediterranean world, fathers ruled. It was a pyramid of power in the ancient world, with the emperor or the king on the top, and an ascending scale of power relationships. Husbands were expected to rule their households, And by the way, the ancient Greeks, including Plato, said the reason husbands have to rule their wives and fathers their daughters is because women lacked the capacity of reason. But so women were also essentially the property of their fathers, and then passed on to become property of their husbands in marriage. For example, one Roman writer by the name of Cato wrote that if a man found his wife was unfaithful, he could kill her without punishment. Cato writes, but if he was unfaithful, she could not lay a finger on him. That's just a sliver of the ancient patriarchal world. Children, too, and slaves were treated similarly. Sons were raised to honor their fathers and defend family honor, no matter what. To defend your dad was essentially to defend God in that culture. This created competition for honor between men, and often again resulted in violence. Jesus resisted this practice. In fact, how many have heard the saying that Jesus instructed his followers, turn the other cheek? To turn the other cheek, which was done in public as a way of trying to take your honor, was just saying, I'm not going to play that game. Because you slap someone in the cheek, and then they're waiting for you to do what? Slap them back. And then here comes the fist. And then here comes the brawl. And it was an agonistic society, as sociologists call it. Jesus said, don't play that game. Don't get caught up into that. Now, this is typical of some of Jesus of Nazareth's radical sayings and actions, which have been lost in our culture. For example, in Luke 6, Jesus actually instructed his followers to forgive each other their debt. The word there for debt is for financial debt. And to give without expecting in return. Now that was radical then, it would be radical now. Cultural anthropologists call this general reciprocity. In other words, you treat them like they're a family member. What would the world look like if everybody treated each other like they were actually members of the family? Now, most fathers would have found this type of instruction or behavior reprehensible to suggest such a thing. What would the world look like? I think fathers would have a real problem with this if everyone behaved like that. In fact, if you listen to Jesus, it would have meant loss of honor in that culture. It would have meant loss of money in that culture. It would have meant loss of power in that culture. And who's going to go along with that? I'm surprised anybody followed this Jesus of Nazareth. But Jesus challenged this abusive system that put men, especially, in hostile relationships with all men not related to each other. It disadvantaged women and wives and made sons vehicles of patriarchal violence. So Jesus' commitment to do God's will, I would suggest, made life difficult for him. Excuse me. In fact, one of the first tests I think Jesus faced in his kingdom of God mission must have been heart-wrenching to him. And I'll just close with this last point. Excuse me. Early in his ministry, while still living in his hometown Nazareth, he and Joseph had a falling out, his dad. It may have been over Jesus' insistence on forgiving debt. Maybe another family in the village owed Jesus' family some money. I don't know. It may have been forgiving someone who had wronged or stolen honor from Jesus' family or Joseph. It may have been because Jesus wouldn't go to violence to defend his dad. It may have been that Jesus was asking Joseph his dad, to love someone who had become their enemy in the village? I don't know. But they had a falling out. Matthew 4:13 says, Jesus left Nazareth. Sons did not leave their village to go someplace else. It was considered a shameful thing. It was considered betraying your father if you left your village. Luke, the 4th chapter, says Jesus came back to Nazareth one day. He goes to a synagogue meeting. He reads from Isaiah. People start to say, remember that section in the gospel? Hey, wait a minute. Isn't this Joseph's son? Why isn't he doing the good things here in Nazareth that he was doing over there in Capernaum? They asked. And you know what happens next, right? He comes home and instead of having a big parade, hey, local boy does great. The text says they grabbed him, took him to the precipice of a hill, tried to throw him off. That was the reaction. They attempted to kill Jesus. But by the way, Joseph is never mentioned again in any of the Gospels. Did he die? I don't think so. I think Joseph and the village elders in Nazareth rejected Jesus. Maybe the village elders were pressuring Joseph as well. I don't know. But imagine the pain Jesus must have experienced from this alienation from his dad. And not only his dad. We're told that once he was, in Mark the 3rd chapter, we're told that he's teaching in someone's house. And somebody says, hey, Jesus, your mom, your brothers, and your sisters are outside. Remember how the rest of that goes? Jesus doesn't run out and say, oh, come on in. Everybody, this is mom. He doesn't go out and greet them. They don't come in. They refuse to come in. And he says, who are my mother, brothers, and sisters? Those who do the will of my Father. So even his family, it seems to be encouraging, hey, give up this kingdom of God ministry. You're embarrassing us. And your dad, come home, get back under your dad's leadership and rule. Now let me make something clear. I don't believe Jesus opposed dads or family. He was opposing patriarchy, the system that was so oppressive. And finally, this blow-away statement by Jesus in Matthew 23:9, where he says to his disciples, call no man father. Again, he's not going after fathers. He's going after patriarchy. Because you have one Father who is in heaven, he says. So he's not against dads. He's against the system that forced fathers to become brutes in that system. So if we bring this back in closing to the historical Jesus, what do we take away on Father's Day? Should we expect to have conflict with our fathers? No, that's not the point. But simply to recognize that if you're following Jesus of Nazareth, it will require that you, like he, make decisions that may be costly, that may require you to be uncomfortable living in this world. That your closest allegiance comes secondary to your devotion to the will of God. And some of our most treasured beliefs, possessions, and attitudes might be challenged by following Jesus of Nazareth. So how does your faith stack up to that Jesus? So we'll pick it up there next time.
Amen.